If there's one thing I've learned from living in an HOA neighborhood, it's that there's always a lunatic on duty. That kind of person who has nothing to do but monitor other people's lives, create idiotic rules, and give hell to anyone who dares to live outside the perfect script they themselves have invented. And guess what? My neighbor was exactly that person. The woman could turn anything into a problem. If someone left a potted plant 2 centimeters away from the proper position, there she was, making notes in the damn rulebook that only existed in her head. If a car parked 30 seconds longer than allowed, she was already sending furious emails to the HOA demanding punishment. But what this creature decided to do to me surpassed all the idiocy that had ever come out of that hollow brain. Her target this time? My blind son's guide dog. That's right. The woman looked at a dog that literally helps a child walk safely and thought, do you know what the world needs? Less accessibility and more chaos. It all started on a quiet morning, or so I thought. We were out for a walk, and there was my son, holding on tightly to his dog's lead. The animal, trained and disciplined, walked beside him like a true 4-legged angel, an example of obedience and gentleness, totally indifferent to the collective outbreak that was about to take place. Then, in the middle of the road, the damned HOA inspector appeared. She stopped in the middle of the sidewalk with her arms crossed and an expression that looked like a mixture of nausea and superiority. A classic combination of someone who thinks they have power, but in reality just has too much free time. The woman looked at the dog as if it were an escaped criminal. "That dog can't be around here," she said, her voice imbued with the unbearable tone of someone who loves being the neighborhood sheriff. I didn't even bother to reply straight away. Firstly, because I was trying to process the level of idiocy I had just heard. Secondly, because I knew that any rational argument would be wasted on her. But, being stubborn, I decided to try. It's a guide dog. My son needs it to get around. Do you really want to argue about this? She pursed her lips, as if I'd just announced that I was going to open a slaughterhouse in the middle of the street. Rules are rules. No animals are allowed in the common areas without permission from the HOA, she insisted. It was at that moment that I knew I was dealing with someone who didn't have a single functioning neuron. This woman really thought she could apply a no-pets rule to a blind child's guide dog. But the worst was yet to come. 2 hours later, on our way home, my phone rang. On the other end of the line, a bureaucratic, emotionless voice announced, "Good afternoon. We've received a report of an illegal animal at your home." I blinked a few times, thinking I'd heard wrong. "What's it like?" The voice continued, impassive. "A complaint has been made about a large dog at your residence. According to the complaint, the animal may be posing a risk to the neighborhood." I almost choked with laughter. A risk? That dog probably had more education than any human being on that street. While the woman who filed the complaint was out tormenting the lives of others, the dog was literally ensuring that a child could walk safely without falling into a hole. But, of course, priorities. And that's how I found out that my dear neighbor, in her infinite stupidity, had called animal control to try to get rid of my son's guide dog, as if it were a mongrel running loose in the street and not an animal trained to save lives. Little did she know that the story was about to take a turn she never expected. You know that feeling that you're trapped inside a prank? That's exactly how I felt while listening to the animal control officer on the other end of the line. The woman had really gone all the way with this prank. Not only had she complained about my blind son's guide dog, but she had the audacity to file a complaint, as if the dog were a wild beast on the loose in the neighborhood, ready to devour little children and destroy meticulously trimmed gardens. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. "My dear, I think someone forgot to tell you a very important part of this story," I said, still incredulous. "This isn't just any dog. It's a guide dog. My son needs him." The animal control officer paused, probably processing the fact that he was about to be involved in one of the most ridiculous complaints he'd ever received. Right. Is the dog registered as an assistance dog? He asked, clearly already feeling that he was being dragged into a pointless circus. Of course, I have all the documents. He's wearing an ID vest, he's certified, and, in case it wasn't obvious enough, he's literally helping my son walk down the street without hitting a lamppost. The agent sighed on the other end of the line. I could imagine the poor guy massaging his temples, trying to understand how his life had gotten to this point. Look, sir, I'm going to have to come over just to follow protocol. But if everything's all right, there's nothing to worry about. Of course, sir. Protocol. The damn protocol that makes even the most idiotic things have to be taken seriously. Half an hour later, an animal control car pulled up in front of my house. My son was on the sofa, petting the dog, completely oblivious to the bureaucratic chaos that the crazy neighbor had tried to create. When I opened the door, I was confronted by a middle-aged man who looked like he had seen too many absurd things in his life to be impressed by anything. He glanced at the dog, which was lying calmly on the floor, wagging its tail as if it were the most peaceful animal in the world. The agent let out a tired sigh. Well, I guess I don't even need to ask if this dog is aggressive. I laughed. If being a four-legged angel is considered aggressive, then he's a real terrorist. The man shook his head, reaching for his clipboard to fill in some useless paperwork. Do you have the documents? I handed over everything. Registrations, certificates, vaccination cards. The guy checked everything, nodded, and then looked at me with that expression of someone who wanted to be doing something other than dealing with idiotic complaints from idle people. Well, everything's in order. I think I can imagine who made that complaint. I looked over, and there she was, standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, looking like she was waiting anxiously for the moment when animal control would drag my dog away and she could celebrate yet another victory against the freedom of others. But to her surprise, and my amusement, the officer decided to call her. "Ma'am, did you make that complaint?" She puffed out her chest, assuming the posture of someone who thinks she's about to make a big speech. "Yes, it was me, and I'm just following the rules. Animals are not allowed in common areas of the neighborhood, without permission from the HOA. The officer took a deep breath, probably counting to 10, so as not to send this woman to a place where the sun doesn't shine. "This is a service dog, ma'am. Federal law protects his right to be here. Neither the HOA nor anyone else can prevent a guide dog from doing its job." She widened her eyes, as if he had just cursed her entire family tree. "This is ridiculous. Rules are rules." The agent looked at me, then at her, and then gave a little smile like he was about to give this woman a real slap in the face. "You know what's funny? I know this neighborhood. I've received reports about other dogs here. But I've never been called to investigate your dogs." "Wait a minute. What?" The woman went pale. The officer continued, now clearly relishing the moment. "Because, if memory serves, you have 3 dogs, right? And, if I'm not mistaken, none of them is a service dog." Her face instantly turned red. Yes, she had 3 dogs. Small, noisy, unbearable. Dogs that barked at every leaf that fell to the ground, that ran loose in the neighborhood, that had already tried to advance on children, including my own son. And this woman had the nerve to report me because my dog, a dog trained to help a disabled child, was on the street with him. The silence was embarrassing. The woman tried to open her mouth to say something, but the officer held up his hand, cutting off any attempt at a cheap excuse. "You know what's better? Now that I'm here, I think I'm going to need to check your dogs as well. Make sure their vaccinations are up to date, that they're registered correctly. After all, rules are rules, right?" Ah, the irony. Her face turned from red to a shade of white that I thought only existed in ghosts. She tried to justify herself, stammered, tried to say it wasn't quite like that, but it was too late. The officer took out a notepad and began to take notes. I, on the side, watched everything like someone watching an epic season finale of a TV series. And that's how, at the end of the day, the person who ended up being fined and notified by animal control wasn't me or my dog, but her. And best of all, that was only the first part of her misfortune, because fate still had another slap in the face for this woman. If there's one thing that gives me satisfaction in this life, it's seeing hypocrisy being crushed by its own weight. And, after the animal control fiasco, I knew that my dear neighbor, the inspector of other people's lives, hadn't reached rock bottom yet. But she was going to. After the animal control officer's visit, she thought she could disappear into thin air and pretend nothing had happened. But it turns out that karma has a wonderful sense of humor, and it hadn't finished toying with this woman yet. First came the silent revolt of the neighbors. The gossip spread faster than wildfire. No one liked the woman, but until then, everyone just tried to avoid direct confrontation with her. However, seeing the supposed guardian of the rules being exposed as such a hypocrite aroused a special kind of collective indignation. After all, she had spent years giving everyone hell, denouncing people for crooked fences, non-standard lawns, cars parked in the wrong place for 5 fucking minutes. And now everyone was discovering that she herself was full of irregularities? Well, the neighbors started paying attention to everything this woman did. That's when absurd reports began to emerge. Someone remembered that she had already held noisy events at her house, completely ignoring the HOA's silence rules. Someone else reported that she let her dogs run around without a leash, the same dogs that no one had ever called animal control about because, unlike her, people had common sense and tried to sort things out amicably. But the best was yet to come. There was an old rumor going around the neighborhood. She was using energy from the HOA without paying. It had seemed like a neighborhood conspiracy theory until then. But now that the neighborhood's trust in her had gone down the drain, some people started pulling the creature's complete file. And guess what? The rumor was true. An older neighbor, one of those who keeps everything as if they were a private investigator, came forward with proof. Photos and records showing that the woman had made a workaround by connecting an extension cord to the streetlight to power a small Zen garden that she kept lit at night. In other words, she basically stole electricity from the HOA to power her ridiculous decorations. That, my friends, was the final nail in the coffin of her morality. No one thought twice before reporting the woman directly to the HOA itself. And if you thought that the HOA, the same one that keeps slapping fines and absurd rules on everyone, was going to let this go unchallenged, well, think again. The HOA has called an extraordinary meeting. And when I say extraordinary, I mean that no one had ever seen such a long-awaited event since the last time someone burned a turkey at Christmas and caused a mini fire in the street. The meeting was scheduled for the community hall and was full to capacity. The whole neighborhood showed up, not because they really cared about the HOA, but because everyone wanted to see the disgrace of our queen of hypocrisy happen live. She arrived at the meeting still thinking she was untouchable. The upright posture, the disdainful face, the classic gait of those who believe they are about to put the house in order. But this time, the tables had turned. As soon as the meeting started, the president of the HOA, a guy who was usually as rigid as a road sign, stood up and got straight to the point. We have received multiple complaints about serious rule violations by a resident of this community. The silence was immediate. Everyone knew who he was talking about. The woman had already started to change color. Among these complaints, he continued, are reports of loose animals, unauthorized events, misuse of the HOA's electrical grid, and attempts to interfere with a resident's legal right to keep a service dog. For the first time, I saw panic in her eyes. She tried to stand up and argue, but the HOA president held up his hand. We ask that the charges be answered one by one. Let's start with the unauthorized use of community electricity. And that's when they threw the evidence on the table. Photos, documents, even witnesses who had seen the wires illegally connected. She tried to say that she had no idea how those wires had gotten there, but nobody believed her. Then came the complaints about her dogs running loose and noisy events. Neighbors were called in to give evidence, and no one had any sympathy. But what about the complaint about the service dog? Someone at the back of the room asked, and I knew my turn had come. I stood up and got straight to the point. This lady had called animal control to try to remove my blind son's guide dog, claiming that it was outside the rules of the HOA. A buzz took over the room. A service dog? The president of the HOA arched his eyebrows. Did you really do that? The woman stammered. She tried to justify it with that lame rules are rules speech, but no one was buying it anymore. The president snorted and looked at her like he was ready to hand down the final sentence. Considering all these violations, the HOA board recommends a substantial fine, as well as a review of her continued membership on the HOA committee. Yes, they were taking her out of the HOA, and that wasn't all. The energy she stole would have to be paid back in full, with interest. The noisy events would result in a considerable fine, and the fact that she tried to interfere with a resident's legal right would still be taken to court. I almost jumped for joy. The woman was paralyzed. The HOA, the same entity she used to oppress everyone, was now kicking her out. She stood up, furiously pounding the table. "You can't do this to me! I'm the HOA!" The president just shook his head. "No more!" And that was how the woman who had spent years giving the neighborhood hell was put in her place. But, of course, she was still going to try one last shot, because some people just don't know how to lose with dignity. If she had been a remotely rational person, she would have accepted defeat, paid the fines, and retreated into the insignificance of her miserable life. But, of course, we know that certain types of people don't know when to stop, and the former neighborhood inspector, who previously thought she could dictate the rules to everyone, decided she wasn't going to go down alone. After the disaster of the HOA meeting, she disappeared for a few days. The whole neighborhood was breathing a sigh of relief, as if an evil spell had been broken. Even the birds seemed to sing happier, but, like any cheap soap opera villain, she came back, and this time, with blood in her eyes. First, she tried to play up the drama. She started playing the victim to anyone willing to listen. She said that she was being unfairly persecuted, that the fines were an abuse, and that it was all a conspiracy against her. The problem was that no one had any more patience for her whining. The whole neighborhood was exhausted from years of tyranny, and when she realized that she wasn't going to get any allies, she went on a rampage. The next day, I woke up to a curious sight: protest signs in my yard. Yes, she had invaded my property in the early hours of the morning and stuck up handmade signs full of ridiculous phrases like, "Dangerous animals do not belong in residential areas. Guide dog does not mean free dog. Say no to disrespecting community rules." I swear I stopped for a good 5 seconds, looking at that freak, and let out a laugh. This couldn't be serious. But, unfortunately, it was. And the woman didn't stop there. A few hours later, the flyers arrived. She distributed leaflets all over the neighborhood, claiming that the community was being threatened by an unauthorized animal, and that if no one took action, everyone would suffer the consequences. I didn't know whether to laugh or feel sorry for the level of desperation. The woman really thought she could convince the whole neighborhood to riot against my son and his guide dog. But you know what's better? Not only did her plan fail, but it blew up in her face in spectacular fashion. The HOA had already lost patience with this woman. The president, who used to be an insufferable bureaucrat, was now determined to get rid of her for good. As soon as they saw the signs and flyers, he called another emergency meeting, this time with lawyers present. What about me? I was simply called in to give the final statement. On the day of the meeting, there she was, still trying to hold her pose, but visibly dejected. Her arrogant posture had given way to a paranoid look, as if she was trying to find out who was cheating on her. Answer: everyone. As soon as the meeting started, the president was short and blunt. After reviewing the lady's new actions, the HOA has determined that her remaining in the neighborhood poses a problem for the community. She widened her eyes. How so? The HOA's lawyer took the floor. Not only had she violated several of the association's rules, but she had also carried out defamation campaigns, trespassed on private property, and distributed false leaflets with the intention of harming a resident. The woman swallowed. That can't be serious. Ah, but it was. The HOA revoked her membership on the committee, imposed huge new fines, and even filed a lawsuit against her for harming the community. But the icing on the cake was when the lawyer mentioned something she clearly wasn't expecting. In addition, the victim of this situation has also filed a formal complaint for defamation and trespassing. The local police department is already aware of the offenses committed, and at that moment, the police actually entered the room. Yes, she was formally notified right there, in front of everyone, and the humiliation was complete. The woman tried to argue, whined, said she was being wronged, but the neighbors applauded the decision. She left demoralized, humiliated, destroyed, and then, at the end of that month, she put the house up for sale. Yes, she gave up, and that's how the person who had spent years making everyone's life hell was swept out of the neighborhood like unwanted dust. The neighborhood was never the same again, in the best possible sense. Without the woman poking her nose into other people's lives, the neighborhood finally breathed a sigh of relief. The HOA's ridiculous rules were relaxed. No one received absurd fines for nonsense anymore, and even events began to run more smoothly. And the best part? My son and his guide dog were never bothered again. Today, he walks around the neighborhood peacefully, without having to worry about some crazy person trying to take away his right to live like any other child. And what about me? Every time I see that beautiful dog walking alongside my son, guiding him with loyalty and affection, I think of the wonderful irony of this story. The woman who wanted to prevent my son from having a guide dog ended up being kicked out of the neighborhood because of her own mistakes. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to comment and like it.